Hello, and welcome to the September meeting of the Barbados Genealogy Group. And welcome those in our Zoom session, as well as those participating via Facebook Live. My name is Harriet Pierce, and I'm the coordinator for this group, which has been in existence since 2014. Today, we welcome Dr. Fedra Aline to our forum. If you will remember, at our last meeting, persons were asking about researching ancestors in Brazil and British Guyana. And I promised that I will speak with Dr. Aline, but he is here with us today to speak on Barbadian connections with Brazil and British Guyana from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. He will take particular emphasis on the Barbadian contribution to the building of the Madeira Memorial Railway between 1907 and 1912, and as workers in Belém and other areas in Brazil. The session will also examine the long-standing Barbadian presence in British Guyana as migrant laborers, policemen, teachers, and politicians. Dr. Aline holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Political Science from the University of the West Indies, as well as a PhD in History. His thesis, Barbadian Migration to Brazil and British Guyana from the late 19th to the early 20th century, a comparative study. So we are in good hands today. His published works include Millie Gone to Brazil, The Bats Rock Murder and Trial, which was published in 2020. And we've all heard the folk song Millie Gone to Brazil. There was actually a Millie. He also wrote several articles that you will find in various publications. His future projects will include works on the Barbadian presence in Brazil and Guyana, and hopefully other little known aspects of Barbadian history. Dr. Aline is currently a teacher of history and social studies at the LSE Secondary School. He's a genealogical researcher, a tour guide, and a farmer, a jack of all trades. Before we hear from Dr. Aline, let's do a little housekeeping. Please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. You can either type your question in the Q&A or use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will allow you to speak. Enter any comments which are not questions, any comments or greetings in the chat. Right now, we welcome Dr. Aline to our forum.
Good evening to all. Thank you so very much, Harriet, for your introductions. And I hope this evening that I will be able to deliver a very interesting presentation to you. Of course, we are all in this new environment, and we have to bear with us a bit, but we'll do our best. I'll warn you in the early, I'll be moving the slides manually. So we have a little technical issue in terms of the PowerPoint. So I'll just move them as I go along. Again, thank you very much. And welcome to all of you who are watching. The Barbadian, I'll start with the Barbadian connection in Brazil. And this Barbadian connection has a fairly long history in that Barbados and Brazil, we know that very early on, it started when Jews who were living and had settled in northern Brazil, after they were expelled from that region of Brazil, many of them came to this part of the world, the Caribbean region, and to North America. The Jewish community here in Barbados, and we can see a tangible reminder of their presence here in Barbados with the synagogue in Bridgetown. And they were very instrumental in the development of the sugar industry here in Barbados. So that is where that connection started. And I will start at that point to see how this this relationship began. After that, we have the period of the post-emancipation period. After Barbadians, because of the economic and social circumstances that existed in Barbados after the emancipation of slavery, many Barbadians were seeking to move on to other places so that they can earn a better life, earn better wages. So Brazil was one of those places that Barbadians found themselves. In fact, Barbadians were, from research, we have found Barbadians in Brazil at the end of the 19th century. And this is very interesting. Again, because Barbadians were travelers, they found themselves working on various ships and moving throughout the world. Barbadians were all over the place. And some research has been done by Professor Cobley. And we see Barbadians appearing in places like Africa. So they were all over the world working on ships. So in Brazil, we see some of these people appearing along the Atlantic ports of Brazil, places like Belém, especially. So they were there very early on. And then in newspaper, you see newspaper ads about these Barbadians. Additionally, one of the earlier references is of a Barbadian in Brazil who is destitute and needs to be sent back to Barbados. So the British consulate is notified of his presence and for his repatriation. So Barbadians were on the move. Of course, we know that Barbadians, because of the geographic location of Barbados, it was very easy for those who wanted to catch a ship. Barbados, most easterly of the Caribbean islands, just outside of the main arc of islands, ships traveling from North America, from Africa, from Europe, going on to South America or to other parts of the Caribbean, they made refueling stops here in Barbados. And the Barbados was a very important shipping port during that time. So there was a lot of movement of ships from various parts of the world. And the Barbadians therefore had the opportunity to gain jobs as sailors and to move on to other parts of the region in search of work. Of course, remember that the major movement was to the Panama Canal, but they were also moving to other places. However, as mentioned earlier, the Barbadians in Brazil were mainly attracted to the Madeira Mammaria Railway project, which was first started in 1887. And interestingly, the ship that was taking persons from North America to work on this project stopped in Bridgetown, stayed for a one-day visit, and the personnel on the ship visited Bridgetown and they enjoyed themselves here for that day. And then they moved on to Para in Brazil, the port of Para, Belém. That was the first attempt. Again, later on, you have another attempt, and again, you find Barbadians, the the shipping passing through Barbados again. And in this case, they spent a little bit more time, and it is recorded that they had an extremely good time here in Barbados. You have now Barbadians therefore had knowledge of what was happening in Brazil. And of course, around the port, news travels fast, and especially considering that these people wanted to have jobs and better paying jobs than what occurred in Barbados, Barbadians found themselves in Brazil. And of course, part of our talk this evening is about British Guyana. And this connects very nicely with the movement of Barbadians, in that Barbadians had easy shipping access from Barbados to Guyana. In fact, the Guyana region, either British Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana, which are just north of the port of Belém in Brazil. And these three Guyana regions share a border in South America with Brazil. So Barbadians, it was easy for Barbadians, if they cared to move from Barbados to Brazil directly, because ships were moving from Barbados to Brazil, and we see records of this in our local newspapers and in the Brazilian newspapers. You see, if you were looking for evidence of such, these movements are recorded. And of course, it was therefore easy for persons here in Barbados seeking to go to Brazil to use these routes. The Madeira Mammaria Railway, this railway was built because of an agreement between Bolivia and Brazil about a region in the far west of Brazil called Acre. And Brazil had annexed that region, a very important rubber producing region, producing natural rubber. And it was agreed that a railway would be built that would go around the rapids in the rivers, so that rubber could be easily exported down the river to the port of Belém, which is on the Atlantic coast of Brazil. So there was an attempt to build this railway a few times. And then in 1907, when again this construction started, Barbadians were recruited to work on the railway. I should also stress that some Barbadians, again looking at the migratory patterns of Barbadians, some Barbadians were already in that region, but there were Barbadians in Peru already. So the Barbadians, excuse me, these earphones, the Barbadians, some of them were already there, and more of them went into Brazil. And we see evidence of the movement of these Barbadians, not all of them, I will stress, but here at the Barbados Archives, you will find in their registers those persons who registered with recognized agents to go to Brazil. Their names are there. There are not many of them, because you will find that in many of these movements, migrations by Barbadians, many of them went independently. So there were no records saying that John Brown went this place or otherwise. Many of them decided that they were going on their own, especially within the context that there was some opposition to people going to these places. There are references in the newspapers of persons of the authorities saying that to go to these places, especially Brazil, people were dying like flies. Basically, that was the notion. Not that some of this was not happening, it was happening in Panama. But Panama was recognized by the authorities as the authorized place to go to. So you will see in our local newspapers long articles about what could happen to you if you venture to Brazil, what had happened to other persons who have been there. So it is in that context that Barbadians started to move into, especially the Portobello area, Rondonia, the territory of Rondonia, and the particular area that was kind of the headquarters of the construction company was a place we now know as Portobello. In those days, it even had the nickname Barbados because the preponderance of Barbadians who were there. We do not know the exact number of Barbadians who went to Brazil. There are various estimates. But it is estimated about 20,000 from some sources. Again, we do not know, and clearly from the registers, we don't have much information on that either. And just to give a little further context about the presence of the Barbadians in Brazil, our own local historian, Alexander Hoyos, his family came here because one of the reasons that they came to Barbados was that his father had met a Barbadian in Brazil. And he told him about Barbados. So he decided to visit Barbados and eventually brought his family to Barbados. So that is how we have this Hoyos name in Barbados. So the Barbadians were already present in some numbers, and with the building of the railway, even more of them went. Of course, Brazil was also going through a period of intense infrastructural development, and many of the companies who were involved were British companies. So both in Rondonia, the area of Portobello, and then also in the city of Belém, lots of work were going on, especially the building of railways, building of various other types of infrastructure. So they needed workers, and in many cases, as Professor Greenfield, who had written an article on the Barbadian presence in Brazil, mentioned, they wanted people who could speak English, because there were a lot of British companies and some American companies involved. Additionally, Barbadians, some of them had experience having worked in the Panama Canal. So again, you have people moving from Panama and coming to work in the construction projects in Brazil. Barbadians had very good experience. They had also, many Barbadians had even worked on railway building in the Caribbean itself, because we had early development of railway systems in the Caribbean. So many of them had this experience, in addition to the fact that they spoke English. So now we have the Barbadians in Brazil, and as time developed, they constructed the railway. Initially, there were only males, mostly male Barbadians were on the work site. They then allowed women to come onto the work site, and many of them were washerwomen working as domestics for the British and American managers on these projects. But one of the interesting things is that the Barbadians were allowed to build homes on the main construction site. And there were all, because there were skilled carpenters, many of them were given jobs to construct the main buildings and things like that. So they had a lot of jobs in the workshops. And of course, the Barbadians built chattel houses, just in the style of our own Barbadian homes. So that, in many ways, is how the community at Portobello started. The Barbadians were very important in the development of that community. And of course, transferring the chattel house type style to Brazil. Additionally, those Barbadians who were in Belém, we find that they were important in the establishment or at least in the growth of the Anglican church there. So you had that community also in Belém. And one of the important things about the Barbadian community in Brazil, you find that, especially in those days, and recently we saw it mentioned in the newspaper by Dr. Dan Carter, the importance of a good 7th standard education. So this education was very helpful to Barbadians in Brazil as Black persons in Brazil, and it is known that Blacks in Brazil are really at the bottom of the social ladder, and Barbadians were able to use the basic education they have, and it was an impetus for them to move forward and improve their lives. So they continued, so-called continued the education tradition in Brazil. Some of them founded schools, private schools, that they could continue to learn English and to teach their offspring in English until that had to come to an end. But they were important in areas of, education, not only for themselves, but for the children of other English speakers in the areas where they were. And many of them went to Brazil as governesses, and to work with the British and Americans. They were also found in places like Belém to be working with those companies that needed to have English speakers. So in clerical areas, telephone operators, they were able to acquire those types of jobs. Of course, as in Brazil, during the 1930s, you had a policy of assimilation, so to speak. Persons' laws were enacted so that persons would all speak Portuguese and adapt to Brazilian culture. So a lot of the Barbadian schools then were closed, but they have the stories of Barbadians continuing to teach their children at home in English, so as to preserve the language. They continue to have connections with things English. Of course, one of the ways you can tell about the size of the Barbadian community back then would be through the amount of letters that were going back and forth between Barbados and Brazil. Even though we don't have records in terms of names, we can see from the records, from the postal records, that there was a significant movement of letters and parcels between Barbados and Brazil. And this is recorded for a while in the records at the Barbados archives. So that is how we can gauge as to the amount of people who were there. Today, the Barbadian community in Brazil, you can still find Barbadians who are Barbadian descendants with the surnames. Many of them have still, they still have kept their surnames. So you will find Alines, you will find the Pisas, you will find just about any name that you can think of being used, especially in places like Portobello and Belém. So I've been able to come across a number, and then we'll call a few of them for you just to give you some idea. You find the Shocknesses. You will find, as I said, the Maloney, the Pisas, Greenwich, which a new one I came across lately. Motley, Knight, Scantlebury, Lewis, Johnson, a number of names that we are familiar with here in Barbados. You will still find them in the Barbadian community in Brazil. And there is some retention of, we may call Barbadian culture. I went on my own visit to Brazil. The time I spent, I met the Johnson family, and they were still doing some sweetbread, still preparing fish the way we do it in Barbados, where we would cut the fish and put in our seasonings and things like that, our unique way of doing that, sugar cakes. So there is still that retention of some Barbadian culture. And of course, some people still remember Kuku, the older members of the community. But one thing that, and that is very important is, I'm seeing, just trying to share here. Just give me one moment, please. Oh, yeah, got it. Yeah, share screen. Really. Just give us one moment. So go back here. Here. So as I'm running along and speaking, and but I'll just give you a quick so we don't, right, well, don't forget where I was just now. So the Barbadian community in Brazil, they still retain some of their Barbadian culture, so to speak. And one of the things that is foremost and very easily recognizable, along with some little retention of food and things like that. And some of them still speak a little English. And many of them are now, when the younger ones are, making it, they are deciding that they must speak English and are going to English school and things like that. But the shadow houses, you will still find one or two of the shadow houses in a place like Portobello, and also not necessarily owned by Barbadians. So I'm just going to give you a little peek at the slides. I know I neglected to do that earlier, my apologies, but we look at the shadow houses. Now, I hope you are seeing the shadow houses in Portobello. This is from the 1970s, and these photographs were taken by Professor Greenfield. And these are in black and white, but these were in the old section of the community at that time. And today, this one was taken in 2012, and this is the shadow house at the Baptist Church in Portobello. And this is a church where many of the, in Portobello, there's no Anglican church. So many of the Barbadians go to the Baptist church. So here you can see the influence. And this shadow house in the backyard of the Sharpness family. And I mentioned them as one of the families, one of the family names that you will find in Brazil, still very much used. And this one, not owned by a Barbadian at all, but here you see the style, the shadow house style in existence and being used in the wider Portobello community. This one is a shadow type house that I saw outside of, well, far away from Portobello, very close to the Bolivian border in a place called Guayamarin. So you see, we have some remnants of the Barbadian presence in Brazil, and some of it is still very much alive. Of course, these are the tracks of the railway, the old Madeira Mammaria railway, passing through a part of Portobello, and the abandoned train line. After the train line, the train service was abandoned. You had all the engines along the various parts of Portobello. But what has happened, they have now developed a museum. And you can, when you visit Portobello, you can go to the museum and you will see the old railway there. And of course, in Belém, you can visit the Anglican Church in Belém, Saint Maria Anglican Church. Well, the Barbadian community, though small in comparison to other groups in Brazil, is still a fairly vibrant little group, and they have been able to maintain a certain level of Barbadianness, and of course they're very proud of their Barbadian connections, and I keep in contact with them all the time, and they are always very much happy to speak about their Barbadian heritage. This is a photo of the Barbadians at the St. Mary's Church in Para. This is a very old photograph with some of the original members. And there's some of the younger folks there, but that's not a very good photograph. So the Barbadians have done very well in Brazil within the whole context of Brazilian society. Many of the Barbadians there have been able to, through education, to move into the professions, lawyers and doctors. So it's a very good, the community has developed well. Most of them are merely middle class, and some of the more, in fact, one of the persons that I like to mention in the Barbadian community in Brazil is the actress Clea Simone's Tate. And Tate, again, is a very popular name here in Barbados and in Guyana. And this lady was one of the first Black faces on Brazilian television. So one can say that the Barbadian community has really established itself and, shown that people who, even though they may be strange in a particular place, and many of them were seen as strangers, especially because they were Black and speaking English, that they can overcome these things and do very well. in their adopted homeland. And in my view, this is what the Barbadians have shown. As this is a genealogy group meeting and I'm speaking to persons who are doing family searches, I will again say that it is not going to be easy just going to the archives or here at the museum to find names. There are the Facebook pages that have been established that you can check me out on Facebook and join some of these pages where you can interact with some of these descendants of Barbadians who are in Brazil. And many of them have stories, and you may come across that name that you are looking for. I am still finding names, even here in Barbados. And I always encourage people to share, because you never know when you may come across that name that is not mentioned in any register here in Barbados. So before we run out of time, I'll now move on to, and we can get some questions after, because there may be something that I have overlooked that you can question me on later. I will now take a look at the Barbadian connection in British Guyana. And again, this connection is long-standing, and it goes beyond what we would normally consider to be the more recent times. Most of us concentrate on that period when, after slavery, after emancipation, sorry, when Barbadians were going to Guyana, or even the more recent times when Guyanese were coming here. But the connection between Barbados and that Guyana region goes back for a very long time. And in fact, when I think of our connections to Guyana today, what was then British Guyana, I remember, and it's something, we always say history sometimes repeats itself. In 2010, the present Prime Minister of Barbados gave a speech to the Barbados Chamber of Commerce. And I'm just, the Honorable Mayor Motley as opposition leader then. And I quote, she said, "You must see Guyana, Suriname, and Belize in the context of CSME as legitimate destinations for investment, especially in manufacturing and agriculture. Barbados-based companies must lead the opening up of Western Guyana, which is the Pomeroon region, and the Ronapuni, and those investments to greater opportunities of the phenomenal growth rates in Brazil. It will change the economics of the Southern and Eastern Caribbean for the next 30 or 40 years. If we do not do it, others will." So end of quote. I mentioned that quote because when one looks at what was happening in the 17th century, those Barbadians then were looking at investment in Guyana. We have the situation where the settlers here in Barbados decided that here we can expand into that region of Guyana, and attempts, in fact, settlements were made out of Barbados in Guyana and in parts of what we now call Suriname. So you have this thinking even then of how Barbadians can invest in Guyana and the potential for using that region to enhance themselves here in Barbados. Now, you have this region being expansive land area. Barbados is a very small country, 166 square miles. So in the 17th century, when the sugar industry in Barbados was expanding and there was little land for plantations to expand beyond what they had, they sought to do it in that region. So they started moving to Guyana, at times even taking their enslaved persons with them. So you have that early Barbadian DNA in Guyana from very early. So this connection is long-standing. What I then call the second phase of the Barbadian movement to the Guyana region is when, after emancipation, and you have the period when the Dutch relinquished control of the three Guyana territories, what we know as Demerara, Berbice, and Essequibo. So these were once Dutch territories, just like Suriname. After these three territories were ceded to Great Britain, they became what we know as British Guyana. So when you start searching the registers here at the archives and at the museum, you will see references to people going to Demerara. In many cases, the older Barbadians remember people saying, oh, that person in Demerara, or he come from Demerara, or whatever. So you hear Demerara being mentioned a lot by older Barbadians, because there was this movement between Barbados and that region. So after Guyana, what we know as British Guyana became British. You had this second influx of Barbadians into Guyana. Again, plantation owners with their enslaved persons moving into Guyana. And there's a very interesting story I found of a Barbadian, and he lived in the hinterland of Guyana at a place called Dalgane. And apparently, he was brought to Guyana by his owner as a young boy, young enslaved person. And after emancipation, he struggled on his own, settled in the area called Dalgane, became a woodcutter, and involved himself in other activities, forms of employment in the hinterland, and eventually built himself a nice home. And his home was used as the magistrate's court when the traveling magistrate came around. He became a sergeant in the Guyana police force, where, as I will speak to later, many Barbadians found employment in British Guyana. So you have clear evidence of the Barbadians moving to Guyana. Some were moved in the case of enslaved persons, but you had this movement. And the most important phase of this movement and connection to Guyana, and which I call the third phase, was that period after emancipation, when Barbadians, then with like the situation as I spoke to about with the Barbadians moving to Brazil, you had conditions in Barbados in the period after emancipation that really were very harsh for most Barbadians, these formerly enslaved persons. And many of them felt that the only way that they could survive would be to get out of Barbados. And of course, it was to the benefit of the plantation owners to have them in Barbados because they provided a ready pool of cheap labor. Barbados did not import labor like some other of the British colonies in the Caribbean. They didn't need to. They had that ready pool of cheap labor. And there were laws that restricted the movement of Barbadians from Barbados. And I show you on the screen the Right Honorable Samuel Jackman Prescott, the national hero of Barbados. And he had to remind the assembly at the time that the laws were so harsh that, in fact, they said you had to notify the local authorities that this is if you wanted to leave the island, that your dependents were well taken care of and would not become wards of the state if you couldn't prove that you weren't allowed to leave. And he made the point that that did not make sense, because how many Barbadians at that time would have been able to provide such guarantees? Most couldn't. So he, Samuel Jackman Prescott, he actually he agitated about this problem in the assembly, but he was also one of those persons who eventually came to be facilitating people traveling to Guyana so that they can do better for themselves. But things in Barbados were really bad. And there was for a period of time, the sugar industry was in recession, and much of the burden fell on the laborers here in Barbados. Very, very poor wages were in Barbados, some of the worst wages in the Caribbean. And if you look here at the comparison of wages in the Caribbean, Barbados had the second lowest wages, the lowest wages in the Caribbean in the mid-40s, mid-50s. And Guyana was at the top of the scale. So no wonder Barbadians wanted to be in Guyana or even somewhere else beside Barbados, because clearly it was very difficult to survive in Barbados on the wages being paid. So many Barbadians moved on to Guyana. Now, Guyana, as compared to Barbados, and so Guyana is 83,000 square miles, Barbados is 166 square miles. So those persons who not only wanted a better wage, but maybe wanted to involve themselves in independent farming, they knew Guyana was the place, and that is where the opportunities were. But what was happening in Guyana at the time was that the Guyana planters felt that they needed to import labor, because those formerly enslaved persons in Guyana, some of them had decided that conditions on the plantations did not suit them. So they decided that they would go into independent farming, or their presence on the plantation would be irregular. So Barbados is one of those places that workers were encouraged to come from into Guyana. And for a while, at least just about in 1 year, Barbadians, the Guyanese had a labor agent in Barbados recruiting persons. And that person, Mr. Day, he was not, this was in 1839, he was not only recruiting Black Barbadians, he recruited anyone who was interested in taking up jobs in Guyana. So he recruited any category of worker that was needed in Guyana. And for the plantation owners and for other trades. So you can see in the ads in the newspapers, He was looking for teachers, dock workers, domestics, the whole range, all types of skilled personnel he advertised for, along with the wages, including even overseers for plantations. So Barbadians took up the opportunity to go to British Guyana to work. Of course, there was some objection or significant objection to the presence of Mr. Day in Barbados because he was now tapping into that pool of labor that was available, a pool of cheap labor that was available to the plantation sector in Barbados. So eventually, by I think the September of 1839, Mr. Day was dismissed under pressure from the Barbadian authorities. His contract, the Guyanese terminated his contract. But what should be known, you can see in the newspaper reports that Mr. Day decided, look, there is potential in this job I'm doing. So he continued to work as an independent agent, sending people to Guyana. So he continued his work in Barbados. So Barbadians kept going to Guyana. And they became a very integral part of especially in the plantation sector. Because even though wages in some cases, Guyanese may say, look, we ain't working for the wages being paid in Guyana. Barbadians, and we know this is something that happens all the time, look, these wages are better than the ones we are getting at home. So they took the opportunity to work in Guyana. Some of them would go for both crops and even come back home. Guyana would have 2 sugar crops, still does. So we would have one here in Barbados. So they would work the 2 crops in Guyana and be returning for the one here in Barbados. And of course, in many cases, they had 2 families also. So you have, so I'm saying this to, again, I'm speaking in the context of the genealogy group, that this is another hurdle that you will have to overcome in finding your connections in places like Guyana. So Barbadians had an important role to play in Guyana. Some of them were able to get fairly skilled jobs on the plantations, and sometimes this would cause tension between them and the locals. And you will have various tensions and a little breakouts of violence every now and then would occur because of the Barbadian presence. Of course, you also had the East Indian element, which provided for another area of tension within the Guyanese society. And Barbadians were all part of this mix in Guyana. What I should mention also is that the educational level of Barbadians was also important in Guyana as it was in Brazil, in that there are certain types of jobs that the Barbadians were able to get in Guyana because many of them were literate. And one of the particular areas that you find a lot of many Barbadians being able to function in was the Guyana police force. And during that time, the 1850s, 1880s, you find that the British Guyana police force was predominantly Barbadian. And when you look at a list of the It's back there now. Yeah, sorry about that. We had a little technical issue there. We were stuck a bit. So the Barbadians in Guyana, I'll repeat myself, many of them found themselves in skilled areas, teaching, police force. And one of the functions of the police force in those days was to be postmasters, postmen, and to go and, like some, well, not many today do it, but they had to do some functions like tax in the area of taxes and things like that in British Guyana. So it was important that they had this, they recruited persons who were literate. They had to work in the markets, a very vital area in Guyanese society at the time, because there were a lot of tensions between the various races in terms of contesting the space in the market and controlling the markets and making sure that taxes were paid and things like that. They needed a literate police force. Of course, the importation or the recruitment of East Indians into Guyanese society, in addition to Chinese, some Portuguese, persons from some Africans and Barbadians, brought certain tensions to Guyanese society. And one of the groups that fell squarely in the middle of all of this were the Barbadian policemen, and that in many cases they were called upon to represent the law, so to speak, in many of the disputes between Black citizens and East Indian citizens especially. So you had a love-hate relationship developing as far as the Barbadian presence in Guyana, in British Guyana is concerned. You had a lot of racial tension. So the Barbadians were in the midst of all of this. They were in the midst of it on the plantations. They were in the midst of it. They were in the midst of it, especially within the market sector. And as these groups competed, the Portuguese and the East Indian Guyanese and Black Guyanese. Of course, within the context of the late 19th century, you have in most British Caribbean territories the emergence of groups seeking to advocate for greater rights and for the Black population, or for the masses in the population. And in Guyana, by the time this movement is starting to emerge, you see Barbadians being part of that group. I notice, you'll notice on the screen, I have, this is a copy of the postal records from the official Gazette. And this is one of the ways that I can tell you, you'll find some names, some of those missing names that you may not be able, those persons may not be able to find. This is from Guyana, I should stress. And this is from 1883. So you will see some names. These are names of persons missing mail, person you can't find them. So some of these people went to Guyana and disappeared. Maybe they went off to Brazil, maybe to Suriname. We don't know. Or they just did not want to be found. So in Guyana, you have these groups. You have Barbadians of all races, both Black and white Barbadians moving into Guyana. In the case of Mr. Briggs Mears, he was in Guyana for a long time, and he came back to Barbados. But as I said, you have these Barbadians now as they settle, they have children, they are now starting to become part of Guyanese society. The problems in Guyanese society are their problems also. So what has happened, what is happening now is that you see Barbadians, either persons who have migrated to Barbados, to Guyana, or their children becoming part of this movement. So from the late 19th century, you see Barbadian names appearing as part of early political movements and making significant contribution to the whole process of getting rights for the underprivileged, so to speak, in Guyanese society. So I'm gonna just mention some of these persons. Again, some names that that will help us to understand, but we will not. I can't mention all of it, and I promise Harriet that eventually I will, what I've collected, I will share with the archives, and of course with the museum, and of course with the archives, because I know that people will be coming to, especially to get their hands on these names, the few that I have found. In fact, as far as Guyana is concerned, I think I have put my hand on less than 200 names. So they are not a lot. But one of the important things that I found in looking at Barbadians in Guyana would be the fact that from that period of the late 19th century up until very recent times, the impact of Barbadians on the social and Guyanese society has been significant. So you find one of the earliest references I found to a Barbadian participating in the whole advocacy movement would be David Strong. And David Strong was the son of, he was a journalist and the son of a Barbadian. And he was in that early movement, writing in the newspaper and things like that. And in the Reform Association, it was called. And then you look at that trajectory right on up. So you have Strong, you come up to A.A. Thorne, Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow, the labor leader. He was the first, he found the first labor union in the Caribbean. And you have his father was Thorne, Thorne's father was a Barbadian. Thorne was born in Guyana, and his father was a dock worker, so was he. And you move on. In 1919, they founded the Guyana, the first Guyana labor union. So you go on, and you come to the period that some of us are more familiar with, and you are familiar with names like President Forbes Burnham, President Hoyt, Hamilton Green, Sam Hines. All of these persons have a Barbadian connection in some way, either father, grandfather. And all of them have been significant personalities in Barbadian, in Guyanese society for that well over 100 years. So you have this infusion of the Barbadian DNA in every aspect of Guyanese society. Then one looks at and that is one of the main sources you can find of the Barbadian presence in Guyana, in British Guyana, will be from the works of Dr. Walter Rodney. And when we look at the estimates that he gave up until the late 19th century, one can estimate that there's a possibility that over 40,000 Barbadians, about these earphones, about 40,000 Barbadians moved to Guyana in that period after emancipation up until the late 19th century. And those are what the records that he would have seen that we don't have access to today, because in some cases, some of these records were lost. But those were his estimates. But we know, because of the easy connections between Bridgetown and Georgetown, the presence of the mailboard system in the 19th century and things like that, you had, and of course, other shipping that was moving between Barbados and South America, the schooners that were moving. It was very easy for Barbadians to move to Guyana. The other thing that is important to note when looking at these things is that both Barbados and British Guyana were colonies of Great Britain, and all of the persons were British subjects. So there was little or no issues of immigration records like what we have today. They were just moving from one part of the British Empire to the next. And as I was told, people just got off the boat and went off to the villages. And of course, if they did not register here in Barbados with an immigration agent, a labor agent here in Barbados, they just left and they went. Records here from 1830, around 1834 until 1949. From what I found, I've only revealed, as I said, less than 200 names. But there was this constant movement. And I will also mention, again, so that we see some familiarity with some of the names that are persons in Guyanese society. I'm showing you here the Eastman family, and this will be the ancestors and the family group that we know of Hubert Williams, the noted Guyanese and Caribbean journalist. His family, and you can get this story right here at the museum, in the Beijing magazine. And his family, his ancestors moved from Barbados to Guyana. When when a white family they were moving from Barbados, the Williams family gave their 2 girls to the family to take off to British Guyana so they can be better taken care of. Another name that person should recognize is the family of Charles Harding, another journalist. He's of the Small clan, and the Small brothers moved to Guyana and to seek their fortune in gold. And eventually they settled in Guyana and searching for the riches. And those are the ancestors of Mr. Charles Harding. That story is also available. That was written in a Nation some time ago. If I only a few, over a week or two ago, I don't know how many of you would have seen the story of the Guyanese twins who are now living in Barbados. I don't know. Well, I know that we don't have all this. I just brought it along, and maybe you all can see it. The twins Some of you will recognize this from the newspaper. Joyce and Jean Allen featured in the Nation. Their father was a Barbadian from St. George. And they have now come to live in Barbados. And they are sanitarians. And the Crocodile family, I like to mention the Crocodile family because Mr. Saul, who lives in St. George, he was very instrumental in helping me to do my research. His family, the Crocodiles, they went to live with his grandmother, his great-grandmother, went to Guyana, British Guyana, and he is a descendant of that family. He came back to his mother came back to Barbados, and Mr. Saul himself, born here, then went to Guyana as a young man to work, and this is in the mid 20th century, to work in the bauxite industry. So he's a contemporary of persons like Sam Hines. So you had this movement which continued into the 20th century in the mid 20th century. But of course, by then it was not for Barbadians. They were mostly going into Guyana to work as teachers and other more skilled persons. So you had this long history, very, very long history of the Barbadian presence in Guyana. We can only just touch the surface of it because I have not mentioned all of the families that I have been able to chronicle, but I just try to give you some idea, and that in many cases, some of the searches that persons who are doing genealogy will have to use more oral histories, because it's important that in the absence of a lot of written data, one will have to do some, acts about, people have to share stories. And I know there are some out there, and that would be one of the ways, because if you don't have data, written records, it's difficult then when you maybe want to go to various agencies to get information. But you have to start, in some cases, with those at that end, asking questions of family members to share stories. There are a lot of stories out there about the various families. Hopefully some of them still survive, and those will have to be important in doing your searches, because there is not much that is written. I believe that my time are it. So I will just maybe see if there are any questions, and anything else that I may be able to enlighten anyone on. I don't know if anything I've missed, but I thank you all for listening, and I'm here available for any questions or comments.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Aline, for a very interesting presentation. We actually have we have a question from Facebook. Okay, I'm trying to bring up this question from our Facebook participant. For some reason, it's not Okay. I think I've. Mhm, mhm. Okay, the question on Facebook, actually, I'm not seeing it, but oh, here it is from Jim Webster. He's asking what role did the inter-island schooners play in connecting Barbados and Guyana? It seems that the connections were stronger in the days of the schooners more so than in this time of air travel.
Yes, Jim, welcome. It's always good to hear you. Um, yes, the schooners were very, very important. Um, and it was cheap. But as I also spoke to earlier, there was this system called the Mailboard System, which existed. And these were there were the British government had a system of mailboats in the Caribbean, and many of the you have a mic on. I'm getting a feedback. Yes, so the mailboat system was, as far as I can see, was the primary way that many of these persons were able to move from from Barbados to Guyana. Of course, there were schooners also because um, there were persons, if one looks at the work of Mr. Morris Greenwich, he mentions the Hooper family. We know of Carl Hooper, the cricketer. That family, they were into schooners and boat building. They were seamen. And that family had its origins here in Barbados. There was constant movement of schooners between Barbados and Guyana. So you are correct that there was this, I don't know the names of all of some of the schooners may not have been mentioned. We don't have a lot of shipping records, but that is one instance where you had a seafaring family that really originated in Barbados. Maybe that is why Barbadians love Carl Hooper so much, because of his Barbadian roots, or the family's Barbadian, and the Hooper family is still here in Barbados. And that family was indeed a family of, they did own schooners that traveled between Barbados and Guyana. So shipping especially was very important in those, and it connected, as you said, Jim, much better than we are now connected with airplanes. And of course, we are restricted by immigration laws, which were not present in those days when we were all part of the British West Indian colonial system.
Thank you, Frederick. There's Sheila Clark Wilkinson is seeking some clarification about the Barbadians. She's asking, that means Barbadians headed to Panama after Guyana? Can you speak about that movement of Barbadians from Guyana to Panama, or from maybe one jurisdiction to another?
Well, as I said, the Barbadian presence in Guyana predates the Barbadian presence in Panama. Although when the French were building the Panama, as attempted to build the Panama Canal, there were some Barbadians in that group. But Barbadians were going into British Guyana from, at least in large, what they consider to be the third phase, which most of us are more familiar with, was after emancipation in 1838. So that was before the canal was what the great movement of Barbadians to the Panama Canal. However, when the canal was being constructed, especially when it came to the latter phases, you had Barbadians then leaving the canal and going into Guyana. So there was a continuous movement early from Barbados to Guyana before the canal was being constructed. But you also had people leaving Guyana, leaving Panama after the building of the canal and moving on to places like Guyana and from there into Suriname and even Brazil. So you're becoming then more into the you come into the 20th century now, but the presence in Guyana goes all the way back to the 19th century, mid-19th century.
Thank you. There's another a question from our Facebook audience from Glenn Beeden. He says Jamaican railway workers settled in Panama and Ecuador after being employed in building the railway. Have you found Barbadians also in, I guess he's mentioned more Ecuador because there were Barbadians in Panama.
Yes, Barbadian, the Barbadian presence, I mentioned Peru, but it was also the Barbadian presence in Ecuador, Chile, all of those regions wherever the British were building railways. And as you rightly mentioned, as Miss Wilkinson mentioned, the railway systems in the Caribbean in many ways were built earlier than the ones in South America. So the West Indians had experience in building railways in Panama and in the Caribbean, Cuba, Jamaica, Barbados. Before, so therefore it was easy for them, in some ways easy, for them to work with British and American railway builders in South America because they had working experience in that type of activity. I can't remember offhand if a Pickering has, I've come across a Pickering, but I can tell Ms. Hadley that she can always send me an email and I can check my list for her. Of course, Harriet, you also have some records here, the Guyanese, yeah, that you may be able to, the researcher who has done, I don't remember her name.
Yes, right. You can find those online. If you search for the Guyana colonists, she has a strange name, so I can't remember offhand, but just searching Guyana colonists, you'll find a list of persons who migrated from Barbados to Guyana. And there's a little bit of information on each of the names.
Okay.
There's someone else asking for their several great grandfathers, the Laville name. Have you come across any Lavilles?
Again, I can't remember offhand. I didn't bring my list with me, but what I can, and Laville is a very popular name. What I can do, you can send me an email. I believe Harriet will have my email somewhere here. Anyway, it's Sawgrass, or you can get me on Facebook and contact me, and I will. I just said the list is not exhaustive, so I can easily make a little check for you and see if any Lavilles are on that list.
Thank you. Frederick, your email address, sawgrass@live. Your email address.
Sourgrass, SOURGRASS, one word, @live.com.
Okay. I will type it in for the persons in the chat. Okay, there is Dr. Ali's email address. And of course, if you have any general genealogical queries, you send them to my email address, which I have already placed in the chat. There's some other questions. Let's see. Someone is asking about the Williams family. The Williams family you spoke about. I assume they want, if they are the ones in the Manaus area now. Manaos.
And this is in Guyana.
I assume they're talking about Brazil.
The Williams, Manaus. Oh, Manaus area. Yes. But very much that may be so. I do not know the exact area, but it is one of the areas where there was a concentration of Barbadians. So there's a possibility that there could be a Manaus.
Okay. We have another question from Robert Luther Johnson, one of our regulars. Where would one find records of Barbadians leaving Panama and going to Guyana? And further, what about shipping or passenger records from Barbados to Guyana and to Panama?
Well, right off, there are not many shipping records in Barbados. And if there are, more than likely they will be held at the British Archives or one of those places. But what I can say, and I say that because remember that the packet boat system, the British packet boat system that operated in the Caribbean, they moved people between Panama and the various territories. At some point, they were transporting people to Panama to be workers there. And of course, they were working generally throughout the Caribbean because essentially, as the name suggests, there were mail boats. But these mail boats also carried passengers. But in terms of records here in Barbados, more than likely, and you're looking at passenger lists, I haven't found any. But I'm not saying they don't exist. May just not be in our jurisdiction. But there was, for instance, one way we know that there was this movement between Barbados, Guyana, Brazil. President Forbes Burnham, his father, left Panama, came to Barbados. He was one of the persons involved in the purchase of what we call the Panama plantations. And he moved on to Guyana. So we knew that that movement occurred. And that is one instance. You had I mentioned the Saul family, the Crookendales from St. George. That family, they were both moving between Panama and Guyana also. Mr. Solemson said that some of the land they bought in St. George was bought with Panama money. And there you have his great-grandmother also being in Guyana. So people were moving between different places. If you look at some shipping records online, especially with persons entering the United States, and you see these Barbadians moving from Guyana. They came from Guyana and gone up to the United States, or vice versa. Sometimes you see that in some of those manifests that may be online, if you're lucky to see them. So there is evidence there. As far as passenger lists are concerned, well, that'd be, you have to look elsewhere, not for sure in Barbados.
Thank you, Frederick. Our last contribution, this is more of a contribution of information. This is from Marcia. She said the 1892 Globe newspaper said that laborers went from Barbados to the Congo to work on the Matadi Railway. This is another connection we need to explore. And the 1890s newspapers speak of the laborers to Panama. So that is another resource for persons who are interested in researching their roots, those early newspapers, and he would have mentioned some of them as well. So I think that we will end there.
On that note, Harriet, thanks for the information. One of the things that, and when I mentioned Peru earlier, and the person just mentioned the Congo, Barbadians, this has been chronicled, that's been written about also. But what I should say is that the Barbadian presence in Peru, and today we talk a lot about what happened in the Congo with King Leopold and the atrocities there. Well, it was happening in Peru, and the Barbadians were there, and that has been written about also in the book, The Heart of Darkness, the diaries of the British ambassador at the time who had to go and rescue the Barbadians in Peru. So again, there's another source that you can see how the Barbadians were moving in various parts of the world. And Bonham Richardson has a book about Panama where he mentions the Barbadians in the Congo. So again, those are areas that persons who are interested in can do a little research.
Thanks again, Frederick. Just one person I want to respond to. This is Sheila Clark Wilkinson, who is asking about the Panama Estates, about additional information. So I just want her, Ms. Clark Wilkinson, perhaps you can send me an email. There are some articles in our journal on the Panama Estates. The local person who has done a lot of research on that is Sir Woodville Marshall. So there is information. So perhaps you can send me an email and we can discuss that. So for now, we've been here for quite a while, very educational, very informative. So I want to thank Dr. Aline. Thank you so much for taking the time to share the information with us here and with all of you out there on Facebook and in our Zoom session. And we look forward to receiving the documentation promise so that that can also be shared and persons can delve into this information at their own pace. So thank you again, Dr. Aline. I also want to thank all of those persons who joined us this evening on Zoom and Facebook. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Our next meeting will be in November, which will be the final meeting for 2021. I cannot tell you exactly the topic right now. We have a choice of 2, so we're trying to narrow that down. So, but for sure, we'll be here with you in November. Our connections, which is due in September, is in editing stages. So I will be circulating that later this month once we go through the necessary editing. So thanks again. I wish you all the best and please stay safe, everyone. I will see you in November. Bye.